Welcome to UWO Now. UWO Now is the place where we talk to the students, staff, faculty, and alumni of the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh about interesting and relevant topics. I'm your host, Wendell Ray. You know, there's an age-old warning against talking about politics and religion at the dinner table, in public, really anywhere, because most of us seem to have distinct, or many of us at least, seem to have distinct and hardened views on how our school boards, local governments, state and federal elected officials should conduct public affairs. But do these impassioned viewpoints lead to higher levels of political activity or higher turnouts during elections? Dr. Michael Ford, Associate Professor of Public Administration and Director of the Whitburn Center for Governance and Public Policy at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, is our guest today. Thanks so much for coming by and tackling some of these contentious issues with us today, Dr. Ford.
Yes, thank you. Happy to be here.
So tell us about, first of all, what is the Whitburn Center for Governance and Public Policy Research?
Yeah. So the Whitburn Center was founded about a year and a half ago. It's 100% externally funded. And our goal is to really demonstrate that we can still govern here in the state of Wisconsin and in the United States. So we conduct all kinds of research related to local government, related to EMS response, basically anything, any place where we think we can make a positive difference in demonstrating that despite our political differences, we can still govern here.
Okay. So was there some question about that at first? I mean, so tell us why you decided to move forward with this type of, in this direction.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm also the chair of the MPA program here, and our Masters of Public Admin program has about 700 graduates sprinkled throughout Wisconsin, throughout the country, working in local government. And one of the things that I had learned from teaching them and talking to them is that they really didn't have a lot of resources to help them govern, really do the nuts and bolts of what a local government official is actually in charge of. And they also mentioned how disillusioned they were becoming with some of the partisanship and some of the conflict in their communities. So we really wanted to provide some resources for them so that they can actually get things done on behalf of their residents. And it really stems from this belief that the best way to increase trust and faith in government is competence. So trying to give them the resources they need to show that we can still get stuff done.
Okay, so is it my imagination, or everyone's imagination, that things seem to be a lot more contentious at every level now of government, from school boards to the presidential elections?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's like nothing I've ever, it's far worse than I could have anticipated. And what concerns me most as someone who does a lot of work with local government is that we're starting to see the nationalization of some of our social issues even bleeding in to the nuts and bolts of government. I mean, I think back to a debate I watched on a school boards, and this was a couple years ago, and they were talking about critical race theory. And you had one of the candidates for office saying that if I'm elected, I'm going to stop critical race theory. You had another candidate say, well, we don't teach that here in the district. And you had the superintendent confirm, we don't do that here. Other candidate doubles down. But yeah, if I'm elected, I'm getting rid of it. And I'm hearing this, and I'm thinking, well, this is all politics then. This is not a board that's going to be able to get anything tangible done on behalf of the people they actually represent or their stakeholders, students and parents, because they're fighting political battles that are totally irrelevant to what they actually need to be doing.
Now, is that something that is new? I mean, hasn't there always been this sort of debate, even at the school board level? What's different now that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think what is new is, well, two things. One is the explicit political party activity. We've had, and it happens on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats explicitly endorsing candidates, funding candidates, doing trainings, and bringing more state and national policy issues to these local bodies. And that's something that's new. People have always had opinions. People have always had ideological preferences. But the actual, resolutions and things that have nothing to do with what a local government is actually in charge of is starting to bleed into locals.
And we're talking about even at the city council level and the school board level. Now, which is news to me. Honestly, I'm from Indianapolis, which elects their local government officials, and they are determined by political affiliation. You see what they are when you go vote for them. They're Republican, Democrat, Independent. Move to Chicago, which is clearly one of its politics are known for its partisanship. But that is not the norm in terms of local governments and how school boards and city councils work.
Correct. That is definitely the exception. It tends to be a handful of very large municipalities that have had that explicit party identification on the ballot. But yeah, it's starting to bleed into more local places. Florida and Tennessee have both had statutory actions recently that have enabled partisan affiliation in local government elections. But yeah, that is certainly something new. And I think it's worth talking a bit about the
Okay.
background of why we have nonpartisan elections. Because I say it's new, but maybe that's not exactly true. End of the 18th century, end of the 19th century, excuse me, into the 20th century, you had machine politics. You had cities run by these political bosses. And this was not just your major cities. We all know about Chicago. That was kind of the last bastion of that. We know about New York, but this was happening in mid-sized cities too. And back then, you did have explicit party affiliation, and you had a situation where your governing boards and your local municipalities were captured by political parties, and they were run for the benefit of enriching members of the political party, as opposed to
Serving.
serving your residents, serving your stakeholders. So there were all these progressive reforms in that era that introduced nonpartisan elections.
And we're talking about around what year did these reforms start to
Oh
come
yeah,
into
we're
play?
talking early 20th century, 1910s, 1920s.
So before that, it had been like we're seeing now, contentious and politically driven types of elections. That
Correct.
If you run the dog catcher, we want to know what party you're part of.
Correct, and it really, some of those reforms really spurred my field, public administration, as it exists today. This idea that we can separate the administration of government, what you actually do, from the politics of governing, which is how you decide. So we have a cliche that politics decides and governing does. And my fear is that if we get rid of the governing side, we're all politics. We have all these people that are deciding things, and no one's actually doing anything.
Okay, good segue into what I want to ask you next. So, is
Yeah.
there any sort of research, any sort of determination that nonpartisan boards and local governments get more done or are more responsive to the needs of their citizenry than the other way?
Yeah, that's a leading question. You teed me up. That's good. Yeah, I've done a lot of work on this, and it really comes down to structural conflict on a governing board. And we were talking a little bit before, but if you and I are serving together on a local governing board, we might disagree on specific issues, but we're not walking in with that structural difference where, hey, I'm going to do everything through the lens of the Democratic Party. You're going to do all things through the lens of the Republican Party. We're going to have coalitions that we can't deviate from because we got to have, maintain party discipline. We're going to create structural conflict. So structural conflict can come from a lot of different things, but partisanship is one that's really obvious. And I have shown on school boards and on city councils nationally that when you can minimize that negative structural conflict type, you're able to give clear direction to the folks actually running the day-to-day operations of government, and you actually have higher performance. So it's not about a distaste for politics.
How
It's
do you
about,
measure that? How do you measure that performance?
Well, one of the reasons I love doing school board research is that we do have student outcomes. We have hard data related to test scores. We have financial performance data. So I can actually link some of the group dynamics that we can determine through observation and through surveys on governing boards. So by group dynamics, I mean things like conflict types. You can identify that, and then you can model that against actual school district performance indicators.
And you've seen a difference.
Absolutely. Yep. Did a national study, and this is going back to, I think it was 2015 it was published, so it's been a little while, but explicitly showed that there is a graduation rate advantage for school districts that are able to minimize these structural conflict types.
Okay. All right. You are listening to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray, and we're talking today with Dr. Michael Ford. He is an associate professor of public administration and the director of the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, talking in general about how things get done or why things don't get done. And apparently there is a connection between partisanship and politics when they are infused in local boards and local governments, not a lot gets done. And we've seen that at the national level.
Oh, yeah. It leads to paralysis, policy paralysis, where either nothing's getting done or sometimes even more harmful, a lot gets done. One of the more destructive findings I've seen is that when you have a highly partisan governing board, you can have a really productive governing board. So they get a lot of things done, but they might not be the things you want to get done. And what's dangerous is you create this pendulum swing because then there's another election and maybe the other group takes control of the governing board. And they try to undo everything the previous board did. I mean, it's the stuff we see at the state and national level. But I would argue the consequences when that happens at the local level are more important because there's not a partisan, there's not a Republican pothole or a Democratic pothole, right? We got to get this stuff done. And if we're viewing everything through that partisanship lens, we're not going to do things that just have to happen, basic services, because the other party is in favor of it.
How you're seeing, at least in the last, and you mentioned this on the last election cycles, we've seen on television where we've seen school boards be very animated and threatening and violent threats are coming through. And what impact is that having on people who might want to run, on the outcomes of what's going on in these particular school districts? How is this impacting what's happening now? What's the influence now that are you able to?
Yeah, there's a couple of things going on. I do think that some of the threats and just rhetoric has scared people off. People don't want to run for local office, which I think is a dang shame because someone's going to run for local office. And I think when you have people that are there to do the people's business, that are not interested in being mired down in some of these national debates that are really tertiary to what a local governing board does, if those folks step aside, it's going to make way for the partisans to come in. I also worry a lot about the generational thing, and maybe this is the MPA professor in me, but we're going to have a generation of people that come to age thinking that this is what local government is. It's a place where you go and you have a fight, introduce a meaningless resolution about abortion or legalization of marijuana, things that I'm not saying they're not important, but they're things that local government has no control over. But if you get bogged down and that's all you do, you start just being a purely symbolic body and just another battlefield for partisan conflict.
Have we seen an increase or decrease in voter turnout, or are you able to determine if there's been any impact because of partisanship and the increase of partisan politics on voter turnout?
I can't say for sure that it's because of the partisanship. There has been increased turnout in local elections. There's been increased activity in local elections, which I think is a good thing. I did some work a couple years ago where I found that 40% of all school board races are uncontested in the United States, which that's problematic because for democracy to function, you have to have competition. And in the last year or two, it's changed. We've had a lot more competition, a lot more participation. So I think that is a good thing, but that does come with the danger. What exactly is the impact of this increased participation? What's driving it? And that's why it's so important for us to constantly educate the difference between politics and administration. It's important to keep educating about what the actual roles and responsibilities are of a local governing official to make sure that we don't miss this opportunity to get people that know what they're doing, because that's ultimately going to impact performance. And if you're walking in and you're there because, you know what, I'm a Republican, I don't like Democrats, you're not going to be very effective as a council member because you're going to be talking past your city manager or whomever it is that actually runs the municipality day to day.
So are we talking about just civility? I mean, if in fact more people are participating, you have more candidates apparently, or different types of candidates. Maybe you're scaring off some people, but apparently others are not.
It's more. Yeah, it's more.
Is it just that the people are just not as civil toward one another? So if that sounds like a good thing. So what could be bad about that increased participation?
Yeah, I think it is about civility, but it goes back to that previous point I made about productivity. You want to have a productive governing board, but you don't want a governing board that's really productive at basically tearing down the things that make a municipality function. And I think the way to ensure that people know what they're doing is you have to do a better job at educating and onboarding folks. So one thing we did at the Whitburn Center, and we've gotten some good national traction on this, is we created a governance toolkit that we've used with local governing boards, so school boards, city councils, village boards, to help them very quickly identify the types of conflict that exist on their board, have little cheat sheets about what type of authority they have and don't have, job descriptions, so that a governing board member understands that, hey, right, if I run for office and I'm elected, I don't actually have operational authority. I can't call a department head and direct them, fix this street, fix that street. That's not what I'm there for. I'm providing oversight and direction and policy guidance. So our hope is that we can start incorporating these materials into governance training so that even if people run for office for all kinds of reasons, once they get there, they have a real clear understanding of what their role is and how to get things done.
You're listening to UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray, your host, and we're talking today with Dr. Michael Ford, Associate Professor of Public Administration and Director of the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, talking about local governance and where we are and how maybe partisan politics has kicked up in local races down to the school boards. The Whitburn Center does a lot of research. Tell us in general some of the things that you focus on in terms of the research that you're doing over at Whitburn, Dr. Ford.
Yeah, our broad mission is to build a foundation for strong local government in Wisconsin. So every project we do flows off of that. Right now, we're in the midst of a grant-funded project related to modernizing the local government workforce in Wisconsin. One of the things we've seen over the last 20 years is, over the last 20 years, we've seen a pretty stable numbers in local government in terms of turnover. But the last 2 years, and I think this might be related to COVID, we've seen an uptick in people that are leaving the public sector altogether. And this is creating a problem because you have all that learned institutional knowledge that is fleeing local government. So you have a government workforce that is less experienced, younger, and perhaps not as well trained. So we're in the field doing research on that, doing interviews on that.
I'm just trying to understand why they're leaving, or
we're trying to understand why they're leaving, but also trying to understand what types of incentives local government officials are creating for attracting and retaining people.
Okay.
What are those barriers? And some of them are things we control, right? It's like wages. Some of them are location, right? That hey, we're a community of 1,000 people. We can't get good people here because their spouse wouldn't have a place to work. Mm-hmm. So it really runs the gamut. It's very, very related to context. But I guess to expand on that a little bit more, we're also trying to understand the ongoing legacy of Wisconsin's Act 10. And if you're familiar with that, it more or less eliminated public sector collective bargaining, created a political firestorm, but it dramatically changed the relationship between local government management and their employees. And the promise of it was supposed to be, the first step was, purely fiscal. Part of that bill was people had to contribute more to their health insurance. Okay, fine. We know that's going to have a positive fiscal impact on local government because you're passing costs on to your employees. But the second half of that was at least sold as a local government reform and a state government reform, where we can start doing more things like performance pay, changing our government structures, things that used to be negotiated through a bargaining contract. Mm-hmm. And the hope was, right, more efficiency, et cetera. And we're really not seeing that. We're still seeing some of that political hangover 10 years later, where people still see Act 10, they're like, that was about crushing the unions, had nothing to do with anything else.
So no more, I don't know if it was AFSCME here or an American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees, that went away.
That was one of them. Because basically what Act 10 did is, aside from police and fire, it limited what you can negotiate to base wages for the entire organization and limited as inflation. So there's really nothing to negotiate anymore. So a lot of the unions have gone away. We're also looking at the presence of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and where those are taking off and where they're not taking off. And part of the reason there is that we talk a lot about it in public administration on the academic side, and we hear a lot about it. But we want to know, is this actually translating into local government operations? Are people operating with a DEI mindset? And to be honest, our preliminary results show they're not. We have this question about, do you have a coordinator for diversity, equity, and inclusion? And thus far, our sample is 100% no, not a small sample. Then we ask a follow-up, do you have plans to hire one? And it's 100% no. So
And this is all, who are you surveying?
this is state of Wisconsin. So this is just in the state of Wisconsin.
But again, who in the state of Wisconsin?
Yeah, we're
is
talking
getting-
to city managers, village managers, and just municipal executives. So the folks that are actually running the day-to-day operations of local governments in Wisconsin.
Okay. No interest in that so far.
Yeah, it's
From what you're
definitely
seeing.
it's outlying, and it gets at that earlier point you made that so many of the things we talk about in government or the things that get attention in the media are really outliers. It's one community or two community that's huge, and it makes sense because it's very relevant, right? I can't argue with you that if you're here in Wisconsin, that Milwaukee and Madison don't matter a heck of a lot. They do, and that's true for just about every state. But when we give advice on human resource practices, or we create sample policies, or we teach our students how to staff a department, it doesn't really help if all the research is based on a handful of really massive communities. It just doesn't connect. So we got to reach these people where they're actually at.
So one of the other things we've been talking about is partisanship and aligning yourselves with certain parties, and those parties pushing their agendas all the way down to the school board level. Now we talk about maintaining that power because, as you said, if you get in and then the next election somebody comes out with a different idea, you're really not, you're just kind of spinning your wheels in terms of policy and getting things done for the citizens. So one of the tools is what we call gerrymandering. So let's talk a little bit about that. And what have you seen? Any gerrymandering has been around for a while. It's not
yeah.
like it's new, but anything different that's going on there?
Yeah, it's extremely.
And I guess we should explain what gerrymandering is.
Yeah. Gerrymandering is where you're drawing individual districts to try to maximize party advantage. So, for example, like in Wisconsin in 2010, they redrew the maps and created a situation where even though the state's pretty 50-50 in our last statewide election, I had the numbers in front of me, but right, Democrat Tony Evers wins 51% of the vote. Ron Johnson, Republican, wins 50% of the vote. You'd expect us to have a pretty split legislature based on that. In reality, about 65% of state legislative seats are controlled by Republicans, meaning there's a disconnect between kind of statewide opinion and then what actually happens when you slice up districts. And the way they do that is you create districts where, right, it's certain that a Republican's going to win, districts where it's certain a Democrat's going to win. And it eliminates electoral competition. And it's not just a Wisconsin thing. If you look statewide, I looked at these numbers this morning. Most states, I think Nebraska, and maybe New Hampshire are exceptions, have a bicameral legislature. So there's a Senate and there's some type of assembly. It used to be even 10, 15 years ago, not uncommon for those to be split. Republicans control one, Democrats control one. Today, there's two that have split control, Pennsylvania and Virginia. Everywhere else, there's one party in control. And that just doesn't track in a nation that's as politically diverse as ours.
And typically speaking, the party in control controls the maps. Is that right?
Correct.
So
Correct. In some states, like Iowa, has an independent commission that does it. But generally, yes, that process is going to be dominated by the party in control. And where that really starts to bleed into local government is I think you can draw a direct line from the inability for minority parties to get any of their policy priorities accomplished at the state level to them trying to get them done at the local level. We've seen this in Wisconsin where like I said, both political parties are getting involved at the local level, but the Democrats were really doing it first. And it was really trying to push some of their policy priorities that because of gerrymandering, they have no chance to get that done at the state level. And it differs by state depending on who's in control. But I think that's a very dangerous thing because we're having the local debate. Really, the premise of the local governing debate is now based on dysfunction at the state level. That's what's driving it, and that's not healthy.
So what then can be done about this gerrymandering? If I'm in control And the whole idea is for me to stay in control so that my ideas get passed and laws are that I like become the legislation becomes law. Then how does this cycle, how do we break it? How is it ever going to be broken if the people in control are always going to be in control of who gets to be in control?
Right? It can be depressing. The way you phrase that is depressing because I think you're right. I mean, I think you're accurate. I don't know. There's, like I said, the state of Iowa does an independent commission, but then there's debate how independent is that. And like you said, I don't think any political party is lining up to voluntarily give up their ability to gerrymander in their own favor. But this really ties into my passion for local government and the mission of the Whitburn Center. I think we have to demonstrate the power of nonpartisan governing. We have to demonstrate at the local level that we can still get things done, even if there's a level of conflict. We can start, trying to understand what types of conflict are helpful. If we're having a disagreement about a policy, that's great. We should have that conflict, and we should be able to resolve it and move on from there, as opposed to partisan conflict. And my hope is that over time, if we can keep that partisanship out of the local level and show that we have an effective, efficient, and equitable local government, that we can lead by example. It's not the perfect example because it's not quick, or the perfect solution because it's not quick. It takes time. But I do think it's the one, at least the one that I have a tool for in my toolbox. So I'm dedicated to trying.
Let me ask you this. You mentioned at the top of our discussion that this is not the first time in U.S. history we've had these types of political orchestrated elections, and the power of partisanship was evident and really how things worked. Why are we seeing a resurgence of that? Is there any research out there? Just lets us know what's going on and why we're seeing the shift.
Yeah, so Christopher Pollitt was his name. He's passed away, but he's actually in Europe, or was in Europe. But he writes about shocks to the system and how that changes kind of the administrative reality of government, whether it's democracy or not. And I think that we've seen a few shocks recently. I think in Europe it was Brexit. In the U.S., it was the original election, the first election of Donald Trump, or 2016.
What about the original election of Barack Obama?
Barack Obama, I think that was as well.
Okay.
That was as well. And you know what? That might speak to the pendulum swing.
Absolutely.
I mean, there is good research on the political science side, and I don't claim to be a political scientist. I have a master's in it, so I should.
I should know something.
Yeah, I know a little bit about that. But right, I mean, you could argue, and people have argued quite effectively and demonstrated that there was a reaction to 8 years of Barack Obama.
Yeah.
That led to the election of Donald Trump, and that certainly that changed the national discourse. And it's almost like we had this simmering fire.
Absolutely.
For a while, and then you had this almost gasoline thrown on it, but it was still kind of in the fire pit. And then COVID hit, and that just blew everything up. I think it just demonstrated some of the fault lines we have in our society. I think we're still feeling the aftermath of that. And where I'm going with this is, right, you're right. These things are cyclical, and we have these major events, and it's possible that we'll have a different shock to the system that will be a course correction, but that can be really painful, right? The dramatic shifts generally don't do well with good government because good government is a process. It takes time. Mm-hmm. Most of our government does, there's not a 1-year thing, right? These are long-term things, and I think that the weeds are growing on our local governments and our state governments because we've entered this stage of paralysis where, because of all this fighting and all of this naked partisanship, we're just spending too much time fighting with each other, not getting stuff done.
Well, what was the impetus for change when it changed at the beginning of the 20th century?
Right.
Why did things change back to a less partisan model?
There's two schools of thought. One's really interesting. I think they're both really interesting. The first one is people embraced the boring. It was budgeting. All of our government budgeting reforms and even the norms we do now, they started in that era because you started to have folks that were really it was almost a moral crusade, but were against some of the graft and things that was happening at the local level during the machine politics era. So they saw that, okay, sunshine is the way we do something about this. So they passed some of these budgeting norms, things like you shouldn't just report your expenditures. You got to show us your revenues too.
Sunshine meaning exposing the process.
Yeah. So a lot of the open meetings, open record stuff. I think that was really what changed the game there. Now there's another side of that that's also very fascinating, and it was Robert Merton, who was a sociologist, who wrote about the political machines, and it was tied to explicit racism and bigotry against immigrants, because the number one beneficiary of the political machine, and the folks that were exploited as well to keep the political machines rolling in your big cities, were immigrant communities new to the U.S. Who really saw that as a chance to gain a foothold. And some folks saw the reaction, some of the progressive reforms, as almost a racist thing to say that, hey, the immigrants are getting too powerful. We have to break up their regimes. Right, there's two ways of looking at how these reforms occurred, one positive, one negative. But bottom line, I think it was just people realizing that it was happening, and that was a direct result of better budgeting laws and more transparency.
Talk about, and before we wrap things up, talk about the toolkit that Whitburn Center has. Tell us about what's in that toolkit.
Yeah, so it's all evidence supported, which I think is what makes it powerful, that we're not just, here's a list of 10 best practices, which is really common in the consulting world in government. Do these things because I just know they're good from experience. But no, we actually have evidence supporting this. We have a conflict and regenerative relationship diagnostic survey. It's actually a lot easier to use than it sounds. But there's basically these one-page self-assessments that you can have every member of your governing board do, and then a really 2-3-step process of how you can identify what's actually happening in the governing dynamic and what to do about what you see in the results. So we also have solutions on how you can reduce some of the problems with negative conflict, et cetera. We have a job description for a governing board member, so they know exactly what their authority is, what their authority is not.
Okay.
We have a cheat sheet for Robert's Rules of Orders so that folks can know how to actually get things done when they're in a governing group, because that can be intimidating for a new board member. Mm-hmm. It can also make things go off the rails when people don't know what they're doing. We have a series of alignment statements where we provide universal definitions for things like accountability, strategic planning, equity, effectiveness. And the idea here is that we can have each governing council adopt as a group these alignment statements to say that, we're all in agreement about what this means. So we're not talking, me and you about, I'm in favor of accountability, so are you, but we don't mean the same thing when we talk about accountability. We can actually define it. This is what we mean. And then we can communicate that to our city manager. We can communicate that to our residents. We also have a fact sheet there on different government forms so that folks understand, where their role is in terms of operations versus administration.
And is this toolkit applicable to any local government, or is it just in the state of Wisconsin? Are there others out there, other municipalities, other local governments and school boards that might benefit from this toolkit?
Oh, yeah, no, it is applicable. We've had meetings with New York State and their School Boards Association, who has started using it as part of their training materials. It started to be used in Florida as part of their training materials, and also state of Minnesota has a conflict resolution center that started using this.
I would imagine that a local government, a local entity, but governing body would need to feel that they need this. You know what I mean? I mean, they have to want to accept the fact that, okay, we need to implement some things here. And which the opposite of that is, we don't need that. We're good where we are, even though they may not be.
Correct. And to try to address that, well, one, we have a strategic advantage in that, like I mentioned, we have 700 alumni. So that's kind of where we started with the distribution, that we're going to give this to people that know us, trust us, that want to use this. But we also purposely designed it to be very non-threatening. It can be really threatening if you say that, okay, we're dysfunctional, we're going to bring in an outside consultant, we're going to have to pay them $30,000, we're going to have to force people to come give up their day. We tried to make this stuff really focused on the low-hanging fruit, things that are very easy, things that can be done. locally, so it doesn't cost any money, and this is all free. Things that can happen quickly. So the idea here is that, yeah, we know we can't solve all governing challenges that occur in a small group dynamic, but we can identify the 4 or 5 things that we see are the most common ways that the governing process goes off the rails. And we can address that on the front end, right when you bring in a new governing board member, right when you have your reorganization meeting. So make it easy, make it non-threatening.
So, to wrap things up, you and all the research you've been doing for decades about local governance and how governing bodies operate, what's your sense of where we are as a nation, not just as a state of Wisconsin, but as a nation in terms of our local governing bodies? How do you feel about it? Are you encouraged, discouraged, or concerned at all?
Mixed feelings. I think we're at a low point, and I think that's just objective. We keep talking about partisanship, but yeah, we are seeing a level of interest group activity. And by interest groups, I'm talking about the political parties that we have not seen before. I mean, there is explicit effort to try to get partisanship into our local governing bodies. And that's happening, and that's getting worse. And it's being reflected in state legislation being proposed in places like Florida and Tennessee. And that's an existential threat, I think, to local government. I think we have a local government workforce that is utterly exhausted after COVID. And I say this, folks, I know from, worked with students that graduate from our program. It's not a Wisconsin thing, it's a national thing, where the amount of abuse they took just trying to do the right thing during COVID-19 is just exhausting. And I think that's really hurt people. I think we've also seen fiscal stress and almost atrophy in terms of how we fund our local governments. There's been, and again, it's not just Wisconsin. We've had a lot of places that have almost frozen funding in time since 2004, and has created this cycle of starvation
Because of the
Correct.
stalemate.
Yeah, either a stalemate or the pendulum swinging back and forth. Right, having a strong and effective local government takes long-term planning. It takes some stability. It takes the ability to forecast. I can have an expectation of what my funding is going to be over the next 10 years, and I can plan accordingly.
It's there has always been a this view and a that view amongst school board members, city council members, state legislators, members of Congress. Always been, this is how I feel about it, this is how you feel about it. I think from my vantage point is that there's just no more room for compromise, it doesn't seem. It's my way or no way.
Yeah.
And that seems like why we have stalemates, not just because there's a 50-50 split, but it's because I don't care what you want to do. I'm not voting for what you care about.
Oh, correct. When you start divorcing the decision making from either the policy context or the facts, you set yourself up for that. We're no longer making decisions based on anything aside from tribe. That's not okay. When I say it's not okay, I get in danger of this. People say, "Oh, you just find incivility distasteful." It's not about that. It's about performance. It's ultimately about the ability for that level of government, the one that people actually interact with on a daily basis, the one that actually determines people's level of trust in this thing we call democracy, right? It's that level that is atrophying, and that's an existential threat, I think. Now, I'm being negative here. On the positive side, I have the pleasure of working every day with our 75 MPA students, our graduates, and local government professionals that are as dedicated to public service as anybody I know, and as competent as anybody I know. So even though we might be in a low point, I think that we have all the tools there to really show that we can still govern here. We have the people. I think we just got to get it done. And I'm hoping the Whitburn Center can provide some of those tools that allows people to get it done.
I keep coming up with another question, forgive me, but
Yeah.
do you care about it? The graduates of your program care about it. Maybe some elected officials care about it, but our citizens? Where is the citizen awareness?
Yeah.
Where are we with that? Because ultimately, that's what's going to shake up things.
Correct. I think that we need to do better. And we always talk about this in government, that we don't do a good job of telling our story. And while that's true, there are explicit things that local government folks can be doing. to try to increase trust. But that takes planning and that takes a deliberate effort. It's not as much as just kind of shrugging your shoulders and say, we have more important things to do. I think you have to start to have, whether it's an individual working in government, but someone there that's really focused on that trust issue. How do we ensure that we are being proactively transparent, meeting our residents where they are at? Because all of those things are reinforcing activities that tell the story of local government, but also make people understand and trust it.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Dr. Ford, for coming by and talking to us today. I'm sure you'll be back on UWO Now. There's so much to talk about when we're talking about politics, we're talking about governing boards, whether it's the school board, all the way up to the presidential elections. We're going to have you back, I'm sure, to talk about so many more things. So thanks so much for coming by and talking to us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay. Remember to catch the latest episode of UWO Now on our website, wrst.org, and podcasting platforms like Spotify, Amazon, Apple, Google, and of course, you can watch us on the UWO YouTube page. That's all the time we've got on this episode of UWO Now. I'm Wendell Ray. Thanks so much for listening.